Hello, I'm Joe Furia, Executive Director of World Forestry Center, and welcome to the third episode of Adapting to the Era of Megafires, a community and expert summit on catastrophic wildfire in Oregon and beyond. In today's episode, our co-hosts will talk with experts in forest projects that utilize innovations in collaborative problem solving, remote sensing technology, and indigenous practices to improve the resilience of forests to wildfire. With no further ado, we present Episode 3, Protecting Forests, Building Resilient Landscapes.
It's important to understand that there is a solution if we can just marshal the resources to get the work done. This is not an intractable problem.
Whereas every, decade or so, you'd have a wildfire year. It was now every 4 or 5 years, and then it was every 2 or 3 years. And now it's pretty much every year.
That the only reason industry and the environmental community came together at all is because neither had an option anymore. SJ and others had essentially shut down the logging industry, and they were desperate for wood, and they were willing to take anything they could get as long as they got some more wood. Fortunately for us, the environmental community was also coming to appreciate that while they might have saved the old-growth trees from the timber industry, they were beginning to lose them increasingly to catastrophic wildfires, fires that would have been unnatural in the landscape in the past. And so they were confronted with the challenge of having to address that through active management, which they've been spending a lot of time shutting down.
Restoration looks different depending on where you are. It looks different on the west side of the Cascades than it does on the east side. On the east side, where we do have fire-prone forests or frequent fire forests, the restoration generally looks like retaining the oldest, biggest trees that still remain. There's not a lot of them, but you start with those as the backbone of your restoration approach, and then attempt to thin out the smallest trees that are ladder fuels, and encourage the next generation of old-growth trees to grow up as a result of sort of that succession process.
The Forest Service estimates that 80 million acres of its 193 million acre land base is in need of some sort of restoration because it is at risk of catastrophic wildfire or insect and disease outbreaks. We need to be focusing on a restoration economy and approach, and we need to be making sure that we can reduce the wildfires that we've seen and protect our homes and our communities and the resources we care about. But that's not to suggest it's going to be an easy fix. A lot of the material that comes off of these forests is very small, it is very low value, and there's a lack of markets for it. So we are going to need to continue to have innovation and investment to make sure that we can remove that material for environmental purposes, not just for markets and economies. But they can definitely go hand in hand, and as we grow those markets, we're able to process and use more of that, and that helps us get more work done on the ground.
Here you go, it starts racing on a west wind, right? Communities here, it's high school, we're like here. But this fire blows out, runs across town, looks like it's gonna be this conflagration, runs head on into this prescribed fire treatment, less than a year old, and just lays down. The resilience of the landscape and the resilience of the community are the same thing. They're not people in nature.
My experience has been that you can make a difference, and what you do and what you learn and what you practice can make a difference. It makes me very, very grateful.
You got to be able to pick your head up every once in a while and hear other people's stories and have kind of shared purpose. But in truth, a generational problem, if you want to make progress on it, takes sacrifice.
Welcome back to Adapting to the Era of Megafire. I'm Matt Donegan, Chair of Oregon's Wildfire Council, and we're here discussing Oregon's comprehensive approach to wildfire. This is episode 3 of our 5-part series. Episode 1 addressed causes and consequences of wildfire. Episodes 2 through 4 are addressing strategies to deal with wildfire. And episode 5 will address what it's going to take to implement these strategies at the scale that's needed. Our general takeaways are that the causes and consequences of wildfire are often misunderstood. The consequences are much greater than we typically realize and far more pronounced with our most vulnerable communities. The good news is we do have strategies developed through decades of research, science, and best practices, but we do need to implement them. And to implement these strategies, we're going to need resources, both from the public sector and the private sector, working together, again, to address this challenge at the scale at which we face it. This week, we're going to address how do we protect our landscapes, again, with the same logic that wildfire is part of life in the West, and increasing wildfire is what we expect in the decades ahead. We need to protect our forests and our rangelands by better preparing them to withstand a greater level of wildfire. With that, I'd like to introduce back to the show Katrina Holland and Charles Wilhoite, my two co-hosts, both of whom are members of the Wildfire Council. Katrina Holland also serves as Executive Director of Join, a homeless service agency in Portland, and Charles Wilhoite serves as Managing Director of Willamette Management Associates, a wealth management firm here in Portland. Katrina, Charles, welcome back.
Good to be back. Good to see you, Matt.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, well, thanks. We just saw a clip that really addresses the need that we're talking about here, which is that we have overstocked forests and rangelands, and in this era of megafires, that's creating real harm both to our landscapes and to the communities surrounding our landscapes. I'd like to get your reactions. Maybe start with you, Charles. What's your reaction as you see this clip, and with all your knowledge working with the Nature Conservancy through the years, what do we need to do?
Well, I'll share a little bit of what I think we need to do. You've done a great job, and our prior panelists have done a wonderful job of explaining why we're in the situation we're in. The buildup of fuel, climate change creates circumstances that lead to catastrophic wildfire, and we need to take steps to address that and limit the impacts of catastrophic wildfire. But interesting in that clip, and I wrote it down when I heard it, one of the speaker said resiliency of landscape and resiliency of the community are the same thing. And that's a very big statement, because as you run through those clips, you hear people talking about the forest and nature from different perspectives. In some regards, the forest provides economic opportunity. It is industry. There's risk to industry. And on the other side of the equation, you have people living in forested communities, and you have environmentalists and others who are looking at preservation of that natural resource. But at the end of the day, the comment was, we have the same vested interest. We want to protect and preserve our forests. We want to make sure we're taking steps to make them resilient and protect them from catastrophic fire, because the net impact is it's detrimental to everyone, significantly detrimental to those who are economically challenged or those who have been socially and or economically disadvantaged over the years. But those 2 points really jumped out at me out of those clips. You know, resiliency of the forest is resiliency of the community. It's in everyone's interest to take these steps. And it doesn't matter if you're looking at it from a private business perspective or a natural resources and environmental perspective. We share the same common interest of protecting and preserving the forest, because that's how we protect and preserve people.
Katrina, I'm interested in your reaction.
Yeah, well, so my initial reaction in watching those clips was sort of what I walked away with during episode 2, which was there are solutions. And in particular, I can't remember the name of the individual that said this, but they said this isn't an intractable situation. There are things that we can do to make resilient landscapes and resilient people, is what Charles has said. So I feel a sense of hope and a little bit of like push to want to make sure that we get the resources that we need at scale to engage in the things that make this an intractable issue. And so that's my initial reaction for sure.
The good news is that people haven't just stood by. There's been folks who have been rolling up their sleeves. They've been figuring it out. These collaboratives have got a lot to be proud of. Folks that might not on paper appear to have aligned interests, but they actually found common ground face to face, really caring about their neighbors. And they have created a tremendous success story and great track record. And now the question is, how do you scale up? And that's really, the challenge is a lot of the work that's been done to date has been really founded on trust, a lot of face-to-face kind of handshakes, kind of an artisan type of approach. And that's been fantastic. And again, tremendous, credit is due to the folks that didn't give up. And yet now, how do you scale up and treat the landscape at the level that's needed? Because as our Wildfire Council examined, we have over 5 million acres of land that needs to be treated across Oregon, and that's going to take a very sizable effort. So how do you reach that scale? How do you fund it? There's a lot of implementation questions that come out of this. Again, I think the good news is we got a great track record. People here in Oregon care about the forests. It's a big part of our identity, and that's urban and rural alike. A lot's riding on this, and so I think I'm very optimistic. And I guess the other thing is, and you mentioned this as well, Charles, is that there's some upside here. When you look at social justice issues, we have an opportunity to create this restoration economy that puts people back to work, puts them back to work in jobs, perhaps in manufacturing facilities, in an appropriately scaled manner, and create family wage jobs in these rural communities that really need it. So there's a lot of exciting promise there, a lot of good work that's being done. Any final thoughts or observations before we bring in our panelists?
Sure. I'll just share briefly a couple of other key points out of the videos we saw. The whole notion of science and mechanical restoration. And I know one of our panelists today, Chris Dunn, is going to speak heavily on the research that he's completed and what he is pushing out into the world of forestry with regard to how to treat forests and restore them. But I think that's another big step towards wildfire management, scientific and technological advancement that allows us to target how we restore the forest and gives us some guidance on how we actually do it. So I think that's a big consideration. I look forward to hearing his comments as well as the comments of the rest of our panelists today.
Yeah, one question that's just sort of ringing around in my brain is that unusual alliance of folks who are typically on the opposite sides of the aisle working together. How long will that last, and what is it going to take to sustain that? I'm very interested in sort of some discussion either now or in the future of what that continues to look like. Like what is the role of the timber industry in helping to maintain our forests, and how do we keep that alliance going? Because this is one of those unusual situations where that sort of partnership, not for just the sake of two folks who are on the opposite sides working together, but for significant benefit to community, like real tangible benefit to community. How do we keep that alliance going and protect those? This is one of the questions that's sort of ringing in my brain.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think it's important to point out that when we're talking about ecological thinning, and we're talking about in conjunction with prescribed fire, using mechanical thinning in conjunction with fire, using natural systems, this is not clear cutting. It's not cutting old growth trees. It's not former practices that really created all this acrimony. This is a kind of a new era and a new type of forestry that's being practiced. That's really ecologically driven. Mm-hmm. And it is what's being practiced in Washington, in California. You look at both of our neighboring coastal states have got very ambitious programs grounded in science that's been developed over many decades. So I think this is we're kind of on an exciting time right now. Again, having figured out a lot of the working mechanics in these communities, and then also having the science behind the mechanical thinnings. as well as a prescribed fire and the ability to create jobs in these rural communities.
Right. Yeah. I think oftentimes in situations like this where you have two people who don't typically work together that tend to work together, the benefit is just the fact that they're continuing to work together. And in this case, it's both that and a potential benefit to the economy, a potential benefit for social justice reasons, a potential benefit to prevent wildfires. And so I'm really interested in the ways in which we'll keep that going and, create an innovative new industry, basically, as you were just saying.
Thanks again, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We saw the clip at the beginning of this segment, and it gave us a sense of what the need is out there in terms of increased fire activity in the face of climate change, combined a lot of changes on the landscape over the last 150 years, and the need to restore our landscapes to wildfire resiliency going forward. So I was hoping that maybe our panelists could share some stories with us, help our audience kind of understand what does this mean on the ground, maybe start with a challenge that you faced and how you brought that through. So maybe I'll start with you, Nils, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. Our community and our nonprofit started really in response to the dual challenges of lost jobs and lost economic opportunity in the 90s, along with increased recognition of new and different ecological challenges facing our forested landscapes and the wildlife communities and fish that depend on these forested systems. And in about 20 years ago, the county commissioners working with the Nez Perce tribe and a range of other partners came together to see where we could agree to work together rather than fight each other, and designed a process called the community planning process that was developed to reach agreement for 174,000 acre watershed, the Upper Joseph Creek watershed, and working with local community members, the tribe, the environmental community, craft agreement on what were the greatest areas of needs for management and restoration, and the appropriate strategies to do that, and then work with the Forest Service to get that work done. And it was the first time that these groups had worked together in that fashion, trying to form that agreement. And we got about 15,000 acres of forest restoration done. We opened up 34 miles of salmon spawning and rearing habitat, did a bunch of aspen restoration and road mitigation work. And the Oregon State University calculated that beyond the ecological benefits, we generated about $6 million worth of local economic benefit to our community.
It's a great story. Maybe, Bobby, you wear a lot of hats here. You represent one of the largest landowners in the state, actually a landowner that was particularly hard hit during the Labor Day fires. 2020, I think, actually incurred the largest fire on your property. And yet you also represent an organization that's got probably the deepest and longest running expertise with regard to beneficial wildfire and the use of prescribed fire. Maybe you could just describe for everybody just the importance of your lands and your resources to your tribal community and all the work that goes into creating resiliency, and maybe some things that we could learn from the tribal practices there at Warm Springs.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, for Warm Springs, this is our homeland here. Our reservation is 640,000 acres in size, or 1,000 square miles. Our forest is 444,000 acres in size. Very diverse forests, from higher elevations of rainfall of 120 inches a year down to 15 inches in our forest, down to our pine forest. We have white oak, a very diverse forest. The most northern reach of sugar pine ends on us on the southern end of our reservation. The most southern reach of Alaska yellow cedar ends on us on the reservation. So we have a little bit of everything that you can think of in a temperate forest. But this is our homeland. This was established from our Treaty of 1855, June 25th, and it's talked about in our treaty and established this boundary in this reservation. So taking care of this landscape for us is very important. We're going to be here forever, tribes, and we have to look out on what's sustainable here on our reservation in managing our forest. So we try to do a lot of fuels reduction work. We do from 3,000 to 5,000 acres a year and trying to various methods of fuels reduction on the reservation. We try to do 2,000 to 3,000 acres, sometimes 5,000 acres prescribed fire on the reservation to maintain the forest. We've had a lot of fuel loading over the years. The tribes really hadn't grabbed the reins of managing our forests until like the last 20 years. And so I've had the opportunity to implement some of these things and do things like we used to do with prescribed fire. I remember stories from my grandmother and my father talking about my great-grandfather who they'd go huckleberry picking certain time of years, and then they would go and they'd do some prescribed fire as they left the area. So it was a totally different forest during their time compared to what we have now. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done here. We do harvest timber on our forest also, but we manage in a manner that's sustainable for the future. And then we also recalculate that every 10 years to see where we're at and if we need to reduce, which we have done over the years of reduced. The heyday, we were cutting 118 million board feet a year. Now we cut 25 million board feet, which is sustainable. With that, with the fire that we had last year, the Lion's Head fire, which was the largest fire in Oregon, was over 200,000 acres in size. 96,000 acres of that burned on the reservation in our forested lands. So what does that mean for us out into the future? That means, one, for sure, our sustainable harvest is going to reduce dramatically, and we still have to figure out what that's going to mean out into the future. So we're doing some salvage sales right now to capture what we can in value. But we also had a lot of other things that happened with tree plantations that we had growing. We had 14,000 acres of plantations burn. Our program is usually about, last year we planted 1.5 million trees in our forests, reforestation efforts. And this coming year, we're looking at another probably 26,000 acres that we need to reforest and replant. So we have a huge effort going on and a lot of work ahead of ourselves just from the one fire from last year. But over time, I did a presentation a few years ago on fire history on the reservation, and our fires have gotten larger and larger and larger. It used to be, a big fire to us in the forested area was 500 to 1,000 acres. That's not true anymore. They're way larger than that, and it's not uncommon for us to have 30,000 acre to 50,000 acre fires anymore on us. So it's we have a lot of work ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, thanks, Bobby. So, Susan Jane, you had a very interesting, several interesting things to say during the film clips that we all just watched, and talk about how the fires are progressively getting worse year in and year out. You've been doing this a very long time. You've been on lots of projects, probably seen some setbacks, but certainly a lot of successes during your time. I'm wondering if there's any kind of one project that you look back on and say, this was a real success that could help our audience understand what is it that we really need more of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that question. I don't think I can give you a specific project. mostly because in my experience, it's been a learning process. So, for example, I work closely with the Blue Mountains Forest Partners, which is a forest collaborative group on the Malheur National Forest out in eastern Oregon. It's a ponderosa pine forest. It has a frequent, or historically had a frequent low severity fire regime. And what we have learned over time is that fire suppression, high grade logging, aggressive grazing has really shifted the species composition, and the way that the forest functions out there does not function like it should and did historically with the use of cultural burning and natural ignitions. And so what we've learned over time by moving slowly into active management of those forests after a period of fighting in the courts is that what the best available science is telling us is that we actually, in those forests, need to remove more trees than we have in the past in order to restore species composition, forest process, and function. And we've learned that over time. And so it wasn't really one single project that has convinced our diverse stakeholders that more action is necessary, but rather doing a little bit, going out into the field with our stakeholder partners and the Forest Service, as well as expert scientists like Chris Dunn, and taking a look around and doing some monitoring. And what we've learned from that process, again, is that these forests are very out of whack. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of acres here in Oregon where science-based restoration and prescribed burning would be appropriate. And the scope of the problem is so large that even our relatively large landscape restoration projects on the Malheur, which are about 30 to 40,000 acres in size, even that size is not big enough to actually get after the problem and change the trajectory that these forests are on. So it's a little bit of learning over time and hopefully increasing the pace, scale, and quality of restoration out there.
There's hundreds of thousands of acres, potentially millions of acres where we need to do some of this restoration, and prescribed burning was really sobering. Mm-hmm. What does that scale look like? Is that multiple agencies? Is that a full-scale federal and state response? Like, what does it look like to actually meet the scale of need? Or is it not feasible?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, numbers soon become overwhelming and lose their meaning because the numbers are so big, both in terms of the need as well as, frankly, the cost of these restoration treatments. In many cases, these treatments will not pay for themselves. Sometimes we can remove merchantable timber from the forest to help pay for those treatments. But oftentimes we're talking about very small diameter trees that have very little, if any, economic value. And things like prescribed burning, while we certainly get a pretty good return on investment with that kind of prescription, it costs money and doesn't have a direct economic return. And then there's all kinds of additional restoration work like meadow restoration or fencing of aspen areas to keep ungulates out. So there's a whole bunch of restoration work that is necessary. Again, millions and millions of acres across the West. And that need is very great on public lands, so lands managed by the United States Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. But then you also have state lands, which are also sizable in terms of their acreage, and many of those lands are also in need of restoration. And then private ground as well. Here in Oregon, we have a lot of private forest landowners. Some are large, some are small, some are in between. And all of those acres, have a potential for restoration if that's something that the landowner is interested in undertaking. So really the scale of what is needed out there is huge. And we need to start somewhere. I think it is important for us to, as a society, because we can choose where we put these treatments, to focus on where treatments can do the most good, where we get the biggest bang for our buck. And I think focusing on where those things overlap is pretty important. And in many cases, that's going to be the wild and urban interface, which is that area where communities and private property bump up against the forest. There's a lot of work that can be done there that would definitely increase the resiliency of local communities. But there's also a sizable need for restoration outside of the wild and urban interface as well.
Bobby, I'd like to point a question to you. We had some conversation during the course of the Wildfire Council, and I shared that I had grown up on a Navajo reservation in Arizona, and we know Arizona has its own issues with wildfire. And I note in your background information, you worked with the BIA, you've done a lot of things, but I loved your point about the tribes. We're here now, we've been here for a lot longer than anyone else, and we're going to be here forever. So this is our way of life, and this is what we're protecting. I'm curious, when you look at the concept of collaboration, you look at the tribes, what are the biggest obstacles that you've encountered in achieving collaboration? Because we know there are private parties, there's a federal government, to Susan's point, there's a state. What are the biggest obstacles that you're encountering with regard to collaboration when it comes to restoring and preserving our forests?
Good question, because there's different areas that I think about when you ask that question. So on reservation, it's the collaborators of the tribes. We don't have the states and not involved in what we do on our forest management. We engage our community here on what we do definitely on our forest. And then also we are provided some funding from the BIA to us on our forest, and the BIA is really not involved in how we manage our forest either. So we have pretty good free reign for on reservation on what we'd like to do. Our toughest thing on reservation is funding, the lack of funding to be able to carry out the work that needs to be done. It's low. We'd be treating a lot more acres than we are now if we had more funding to be able to do that. And so that's something I know I bring up quite often whenever I talk to congressionals, is that we need more funding. It's critical to be able to maintain good forest health out there and do the things that need to be done for the forest. So that's the on reservation. Off reservation, we have treaty rights. And so we do work off reservation and collaborate with the forests around us. So we have the Mount Hood Forest that butts against our boundary. We have the Deschutes National Forest and the Willamette National Forest all abut along our boundaries. So we talk to them quite often about what we would like to do in projects and collaborating with them. Sometimes it's just challenging to get some of the folks that are in the collaborations to understand and educate them on what the need is. And it's been for us a big hurdle and a big challenge to get folks to understand what needs to be done and why we're doing it. And sometimes we don't get things done because they just don't understand and don't want it to happen. So that is, for our experience, has been a big challenge, especially for our boundaries. They're trying to do projects like Tribal Forest Protection Act. And we've not been successful to be able to do Tribal Forest Protection Acts because we get stopped in trying to just do simple fuels reduction work.
Well, and I really appreciate that. And if I might quickly, Matt, I don't think it was lost on anyone that you said you had the largest fire during the Labor Day fires. And I think we've all acknowledged on this program that we look at impacts on all people in Oregon, but particularly populations of color. And the fact that fire was the largest fire on your lands, and you talked about lack of funding, I think that's a loud bell that we all need to pay attention to. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing that with us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, if I could just add to that point that Charles just made, there's been some interesting social science research recently looking at wildfire risk reduction, hazardous fuels reduction types of projects, and where those projects are most often implemented and what communities they serve. And to Charles's point, many of these sorts of projects seem to be implemented in areas where there are populations that can most avail themselves of things like the environmental analysis process, or have easy access to their congressional representatives. And for rural communities and communities of color that do not have that ease of access, it turns out that those communities don't see as many hazardous fuels reduction projects as other communities do that are frankly more well-heeled and have better access to the levers of power. And so I think it's an interesting developing environmental justice issue about where we put these treatments. And again, to my earlier point, we don't really want to see random acts of restoration. We want to see restoration work to address the wildfire problem where they can do the most good. And in many cases, that may be near or adjacent to communities that typically have not had the luxury of having these community protection treatments implemented near their communities.
Yeah, I think that's an outstanding point. And I think it, in so many ways, wildfire, just bears the characteristics of climate change in general, which is the greatest impacts on our most vulnerable communities, and those same communities not having the representation to deal with the effects of climate change, or in this case, wildfire. And it really does speak to the environmental justice issues that are incumbent all throughout the wildfire debate. I want to turn the discussion over to Dr. Dunn. So, Chris, one of the things that we talked a lot about with the Wildfire Council is just how much we have learned. It's not as if we've been caught flat-footed. It's not as if suddenly we've had a bad decade. And where do we start? We've got the benefit of decades and decades of research and science. And as you maybe speak to that, start with, how do we better model fire risk and better understand where are the greatest risks? And to Susan Jane's point, and then overlay that against the values of risk, and so that we can prioritize where do we treat, and then maybe final wrap up with and how do we integrate mitigation treatments and suppression planning so that we keep our firefighters safe and keep our communities safe. So maybe you could speak kind of to the state of the art. Where are we with the science?
Wow, thanks for that question, Matt. Then a big question that is, and we talk about decades of knowledge and understanding, and there's centuries and millennia from our predecessors on this landscape, and that knowledge is still around and can still help inform us in moving forward, and is actually probably more critical than it ever has been in recent times. But from the scientific perspective, we were seeing information saying, the forest is changing, the fields are changing back in the 40s. These were posited early on when the establishment of the Forest Service, late 19th century, early 20th century. But by the 40s, out of the Warm Springs Reservation, some folks were publishing papers saying, look, we're already seeing these great changes. And so we've seen that data and that information for 80 years. And here we're thinking about moving forward. And the perspective that I tend to bring to the table is that, we've spent a lot of time thinking about the ecosystems and the ecology, and a lot of recovery to our past interactions with these landscapes. And what was missing a lot in that conversation really was, how do firefighters see the landscape? How do they engage with the landscape? What does that mean in terms of rising to this challenge today? And it is a fundamentally different perspective than a silviculturist might take or a forest ecologist might take. Firefighters are really thinking about what values are we trying to protect through our actions, as well as how can we do that safely and be most successful. And this is really brings us into this, typical or common risk management cycle, if you will, where you really are identifying, what is it that is the hazard or the entity that we're trying to address? In this case, wildfire, pretty obvious. And then, all right, with that, how do we make an assessment? And computing is advanced well enough, and our understanding of fire behavior modeling is advanced well enough to date where we can start to make really well established risk assessments. And that risk assessment really relies on a lot of wildland fire simulations. So we can look at the burn probabilities, the intensity of the fire that we would expect at that time. And then we can work through a real collaborative process with stakeholders, collaborators, community members, informed community members or otherwise, and really bring them to the table and talk about the values that we place on these landscapes. And that can be integrated directly with the other analytics. So we can really mesh local knowledge. We can ingest local information and experiences from people and practitioners and mash that with our analytics. And that really offers two forms. One, a better, more comprehensive picture of what we're dealing with in wildfire risk, as well as a way to bring the community members and stakeholders along in this process as we all begin to re-envision our relationship with the landscape and our relationship with fire. And then once we do that and we start to set out these frameworks that really lay out how firefighters are thinking about it, then we can start to broaden out beyond public lands into private lands and really start to look at the system as a whole together from, maybe Forest Service, the largest firefighting organization in the world, all the way down into these local communities and their fire response as well, and bring symmetry to that process. And then start to overlay restoration treatments that Susan Jane was talking about earlier, to where they really are informing and supporting our wildland fire management response.
So Nils, one of the themes we're hearing a lot here during this panel, and we also heard it during episode 1, hear it very frequently, is the need to be increasing the pace and scale in a very thoughtful, high quality manner, and without losing sight of the need for environmental protections and without losing sight for why we're doing this, which is really the public values. We do need to increase the pace and scale, and we need to fund this. And you often use this term restoration economy as kind of a concept for us to think about how do we restore these landscapes and fund them and create jobs. And in doing so, really struggling with how do you create markets for these small diameter products and so forth. And I was wondering if maybe you could kind of walk us through that, really start with the forest, with the prescription, what this is and what this isn't, including integrating fire and so forth, and then what kind of wood flows might come off of these restoration treatments. And then how do we finally turn that into something that is actually, creates revenues to offset some of these costs?
Okay, nice small question. Thanks. But no, I mean, it's a good one. And I appreciate too where Chris was, because it reminded me of some of the early ecologists I read with observations from the Blue Mountains. And I didn't go back as far as he did, but starting in the 70s, the ecologists there were noting a profound shift in forest stand conditions, with a shift from more shift away from the dominance of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir to increased an increased distribution and presence of shade tolerant trees like grand fir, and a much higher number of stems per acre, trees per acre, and generally smaller diameter classes across the forest. And they were recognizing that there were a number of challenges resulting from this shift in forest conditions. The one that's drawn a lot of attention is the wildfire risk that results from more continuity of fuel across the landscape, so horizontal continuity, but also vertical continuity from the forest floor to the crown. And the combination of those is leading to, as Bobby mentioned earlier, an increase in the average size of fires, and most importantly, an increase in the amount of acres that experience high severity fire, as opposed to this more mosaic pattern of fire that was more naturally occurring in these landscapes. But you also have pretty significant shifts in wildlife habitat, and increasingly a recognition that there's significant impacts to watershed hydrology, because these denser stands are preventing particularly snow, but all forms of precipitation from reaching the ground. So you intercept the precipitation, and then you have more straws in the ground that are using that water. So there's less water flowing to the streams and rivers that are important to sustain salmon and other aquatic life. And our community sort of recognized that and saw an opportunity when Wallowa Resources was started to really embrace a movement away from sort of traditional forestry and the harvest, the primary focus being a sustained yield of commercial saw logs and commercially valuable logs, to a more balanced approach that would use the science, as everybody has mentioned today, that being sort of the critical grounding point, and then being really innovative, doing the R&D, so that if the science is suggesting an increased harvest of small diameter trees, which it is, and we're seeing a dramatic shift in the volume removed in any sort of restoration harvest. In the past, it might have been 80% of the trees removed were commercial saw logs. Now it's often less than 50%. So you're handling a lot of small diameter trees, and that's necessary to improve forest health. It has a cost, but it also means there's a lot of work to be done. And if we can embrace that, we can put a lot of people back to work. And if we also invest in the R&D on the product development, the processing technology, the market development, this doesn't all have to be a cost to the taxpayer. And so our community came together around that, sort of initially thinking about the restoration economy as an opportunity for a win-win, an opportunity to put people back to work and generate good jobs and revenue within our community, but also generate that environmental benefit, that ecological benefit that Americans wanted from their public lands, from their National Forest System lands. But the more we sort of got into this and worked with all of our partners, including the Nez Perce tribe in Wallowa County, it was a recognition that this is a long-term commitment. So it's beyond just sort of the initial restoration investment. And we started speaking about a stewardship economy that really kind of reflects that reciprocity between people caring for the land and the natural resources, in return caring for us, the individuals and people living within those landscapes. And we've really tried to build our programs and our partnerships around that vision, and we're having some success. That early story that I told you, that was really 174,000 acres. More recently, the Northern Blues Forest Collaborative that works on the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest and the Umatilla National Forest, as working with Oregon Department of Forestry and several thousand non-industrial private landowners, and with outreach to the Nez Perce tribe and the Confederated tribes, and slowly to you, Bobby, and the Warm Springs, sort of thinking about how do we, across these land boundaries, across property boundaries and jurisdictions, work together so that our restoration efforts are achieving the scale and patterns that we need to have an impact, to really reduce high severity, large scale fire effects, maintain wildlife continuity, restore watershed hydrology that benefits all of us.
Thanks for that, Nils. Question I have is for Chris. And Chris, I'm going to be nice to you, even though you're an Oregon State Beaver and I'm a Sun Devil. But I'm going to ask you this nice question. Your science is based on actual experience in the field fighting fires combined with a lot of education. And I'm curious, your three-pronged approach is very specific. Do you receive pushback on that science? And if you do, what is it? Because I read through some of your materials and I said, how do you challenge this? Why wouldn't everyone say, well, he's got the educational background, he's got the practical experience fighting fires. How do people challenge you, or do they challenge you?
Wow, what an easy question.
Easy.
Oh, you Sun Devils.
And maybe they don't. I guess a better question is, how do people not embrace it?
So we've had great success with people embracing the process. And I think our success stems from our co-production methods and model and our general desire for inclusiveness when we enter into these conversations. So we bring some analytics to the table in my work, and these wildfire analytics provide a foundation, a starting point, and sort of a shared picture for all of us to work from together. But we do not devalue anybody's personal experiences, and we seek that and we reach for that, and we try to do everything we can to bring that to the table, whether it's from the fire managers themselves, community, or the broader community as a whole. And by going through that process in that what we call a co-production, which in many cases is a collaborative process, but it's not always, it's co-producing an outcome together. And by starting people at the beginning with us, they understand the steps we're taking, the methods we're taking, the goals that we're all trying to achieve together. And then by the end, they can see a product that they have helped produce. And in so doing, there's a greater acceptance at that end result. And I think that's what's given us a leg in the process that we bring to the table typically with our science.
I had a question for Nils, sort of going back to your point earlier about, or sort of the question that Matthew asked around a restoration economy. One of the things that I noticed in the video that sort of stuck out to me, and forgive me if I'm using the incorrect language or anything, as I've always said, I'm the new person on the block because I come from the world of housing who's affected by wildfire, not necessarily how to manage it. But one of the things that really stuck out to me in the video clip that we were watching prior to this discussion is the opportunity that's presented itself where two folks who are mostly on opposite sides of the aisle are working together for shared common interest, not just for the sake of shared common interest, and not just for the sake of working together as a benefit in itself, but actually because of these opportunities of building a restoration economy and putting people back to work, of taking care of our dealing with the landscapes and trying to make them more resilient, and potentially, doing some restoration and thinning some of these lands. And so that to me is really interesting. It seems like there's a real tangible benefit here. What is it going to take? Like, I guess I would ask this of everyone here, like, what is the big picture future look like to keep that kind of collaboration going to achieve those tangible benefits? I'm so curious to hear from y'all on that.
The starting point, as Susan Jane and many others have said over and over, is initially building relationships and trust and being willing to sort of listen and seek to understand better the different perspectives of the people you're trying to collaborate with. And as you build that relationship and that trust, I think you and communicate more, I think you understand that you actually share more values in common, and you share, the same sort of a much more similar desired future than you presume going into that, and that the the political, the social, the legal conflict doesn't need to be a zero-sum game, that there are opportunities for win-wins. And I think that has become more and more clear in the West, where it has been for a long time a conflict about protecting nature and using nature. And there's more of a recognition that that across the landscape, there's going to be places that we want to protect with wilderness area designations and others, and we obviously have other places that are very much focused on the production of food and fiber, and then there's this working landscapes in between where there's a real need for us to invest in sort of applied R&D and in learning together. Again, as Susan mentioned earlier, how can we work together to restore forests, create some jobs, and recognize that the long-term health of that forest depends on a skilled, trained, knowledgeable workforce and the support of science universities and researchers, and the support from the industry that helps create value from the byproducts of that restoration work. And then, we need to be better storytellers too. We need to make sure that the stories that inspire and motivate the next generation to get into this work come forth, and that we also have tremendous integrity in the work we do, so that if we've tried something and it's failed, we're honest about that failure and we learn from it and correct from that. Because we can't afford to lose trust again if we're going to keep building this collaborative effort and building scale.
I want to follow up with that with Susan Jane. Let's just paint a really ambitious vision here and say we do continue to build trust, and we do continue to invest in R&D, and we do continue to learn from our mistakes. You look out 15, 20 years. I mean, when you think about what we're building towards, what does that look like to you?
Well, it's a good question, and I think it depends on who you ask, what kind of answer you would get. On the Malheur, our collaborative partners, the vision that we are shooting for in 15, 20 years, hopefully sooner, but 15, 20 years, is to be able to sit on my deck out in John Day in the summer and watch the storm clouds roll in and watch the lightning storm and kick back with an adult beverage and just watch it happen and know that it's okay, that we've done the work out there, that we have our potential operational delineations out there. We have our pods, we've done our mechanical work and our prescribed burning, and those natural ignitions can be allowed to do what they need to do out there on that landscape, which is to continue to create that mosaic pattern of burned and unburned forest, so that we can restore that function and the species composition and the processes that we really want to see on those lands. So that's kind of our vision, and it's what we all really are hoping for. But it's going to take a lot of work to get there. Even on the Malheur, where we've been working together for a very long time, we do have a fair amount of agreement, and we do have pretty good relationships. But all of that is still tenuous. Relationships are tenuous. External things can occur that challenge relationships or challenge funding sources or anything like that. And so our work together is very special. It's also really durable, but it can change. And I think that that's important to keep in mind, because just as we are working with landscapes and ecology that have changed over time, so do those social relationships. And I think that you kind of got to have a good aligning of the stars to have everything go your way and to be able to achieve that vision of sitting on my deck and watching the storm clouds come in August.
When you take a look at our current trajectory, and what's at stake given climate change and the vegetation levels and the growth inside the WUI, and the fact that we've got so much of the development inside the WUI came before we had better building designs and building materials and so forth. There's a lot at stake here, and as you look over the next 10, 20 years, if things don't turn out the way that we're hoping, what are some of the things that we should really be thinking about? And specifically with regard to the health of our ecosystems. I mean, what happens if suddenly these unnatural fires are kind of allowed just to kind of do their thing without the proper kind of stewardship that everybody here is talking about?
James was spot on a good vision there. I mean, I personally have been working fire here on the reservation since 1981 and have seen the changes. I was the tribe's wildland fire administrator for the Lion's Head fire. Our forest has definitely changed, and getting it back into a resilient forest, one that can handle the natural events with lightning coming rolling through them is, I think a goal for a lot of us everywhere. So out into the future, the tribes were always going to be here, as I said earlier, and it's making sure we're taking care of our forests out for future generations. For the tribes, we're looking 7 generations out, and what are we going to have for those folks out into the future? And we need to take care of. And you made me think about, the gifts the Creator gave us here for us is, number 1 is water, 2 is our fish, 3 is our wildlife, and 4 is our roots and berries, and taking care of those. And so we need to have those out into the future for our tribal members. And Chris, I'm going to go way back. You had talked about, what a firefighter thinks when they're fighting fire and that. For Warm Springs, for our firefighters, right now we're in the middle of hiring all our crews. There's about 120 plus tribal members that are fighting fire for us here on reservation. And so when they fight fire and do initial attack here on the reservation, they have a different mindset. They're thinking, hey, this is an area that I hunt, my family hunts. We need to take care of this area, and we don't want it to burn because we have elk and deer in here. Here's a watershed that has a good watershed for our spring Chinook salmon. We have salmon that spawn in our waters here in Warm Springs and Steelhead, and we have the healthiest population of bull trout in the lower 48 on the reservation. They're thinking about those things. They're thinking about, here's a huckleberry field here. This is where my grandma picks huckleberries. I need to be taking care of that and make sure, we don't have the fire get into those areas. So that's, in the mindsets of, our firefighters and myself. That's what's going through my head is as we're, taking care of this resource out there, and especially when we have these fire events that come in, and now they're getting larger. And the one thing we have not talked about today is climate change. And what does that mean into the future? What we are noticing that we are seeing a shift in our vegetation. We're seeing a shift in just in Warm Springs, our ponderosa pine forest is changing. And we've been primarily talking about east side forests, which are the dry forests. And you get onto the west side, which is the wet forest. And you saw what happened last year, and with climate change, are the west side forest now starting to act more like an east side forest. And so that's very concerning on the future. So what do we do to try to mitigate these drought situations that we're going to be in a drought this year already? So, that's what's on our minds. That's, what are we going to do out in the future and keep things sustainable for everyone.
We, as Euro Americans or otherwise, don't tend to think that far out. We don't look that far out. We're often thinking much more short-term and short-term gain. And in so doing, we're missing a lot of trends that are happening and a lot of change that just passes our eyes because we aren't giving that much attention to it. And the trajectory we're on right now with the fires we see And granted, the fires that we are experiencing are the worst fires that are igniting on our landscape. We are, as a whole, our fire management organization remains extremely successful at putting fires out. We're still suppressing 97 to 98% of the wildfires that are igniting on our landscapes. We're seeing the 2 to 3%, and they're escaping for a reason. They're escaping because they're occurring under the worst conditions. And then we're impacting our landscapes with the worst outcomes by doing so. And it is a fundamental choice that we as a society and a culture are making. We're making those choices every time we go out and look at a fire and size it up to put it out. And so if we continue on that path, we're going to continue to accumulate these large patches of high severity fire that Nils and others have explained, have described on the landscape. These are very uncharacteristic and different than how the structure, processes, and functions of our forest operated in the past, at least on the east side in the dry forest conditions. And with climate change coming on and the current state of our ecosystems, we're going to amass more and more of that at what it will likely be an ever increasing rate. We saw a huge stair step, if you will, increase in fire area burning around 2000, 2001. It seems to be occurring again in maybe 2012, 2015. We're experiencing another, and it's likely to continue to incline. So we're 20 years into seeing already an exacerbated condition. The next 20 years are likely to be more challenging on that front. And we're preferentially for the wrong ones. There really is, we cannot just say, let it all happen. Let fires that ignite, burn, and be as they will. As Susan Jane described that as a vision, it's a vision that we certainly should have for the future, but it's not a vision that exists now in many parts of our landscape. And so there is a way to really methodically start to work our way in that direction through pre-planning, thinking about these large fires outside of fire season when they're not occurring, addressing that in the times over the winter and now in these types of conversations, and start thinking about it and start sharing the load of what that vision is and sharing that risk together and really coming together for something different in the future. And if we don't, the consequences are going to continue to surprise us, and they're not going to be the outcomes that we like to see on our ecosystem as a whole, and not just our ecosystems, our communities and our people.
It's been great listening to all of you, and your perspectives are, I think, to everyone, valuable and impactful because of where you're coming from. You are experts in your area. You've dedicated your lives to addressing this very issue. So I really appreciate hearing from you. And Bobby, I'll close my final comment or question and point it towards you. Your family has had businesses, cattle, logging, working off and relating to the land, and you've had a lifetime of addressing the health of the forest and fire. You're someone who's on both sides of everything, and I'm curious. People take sides in this issue. You're on all sides. How do you approach that with people when you're talking with them about the need to address the fires and this wildfire issue that we're dealing with?
Looking at the science out there and what we're learning from that, looking at our future, as I mentioned, the 7 generations out is, as we're doing these things on our landscape here, that we got to be very mindful. And that's the way we're taught, is to be mindful of the future and that we're not taking more from the land than it can sustain. And so what do we do when we have these fuel loading events and trying to reduce them out on the landscape to protect all these valuable natural resources that are important to the tribes and important to everyone? Fish is very important to us, and the water is the number one gift that the Creator gave to us, and we got to take care of these watersheds.
I do have one sort of big question that I think is really important in this discussion, and that is, I appreciate that there's an acknowledgement of indigenous practices that America has in so many different ways, totally obliterated and have disrespected. And so I know one of the things that we experience in my community is sort of this thirst and hunger to know about our culture, to know about the things that we do, to understand how we would approach different situations. And I'm just sort of curious to hear from Bobby. I would imagine you're experiencing some of the same things in this situation, a similar occurrence with this. Like, what is a message that you would like to get across to some of the folks who are not in your culture, not in your community, in terms of how to approach and ask some of these questions respectfully, and how to honor the time, energy, and effort, and quite honestly, the expertise that you possess without being exploitive. That's one of the things that I really worry about in this discussion.
Thank you. It's the tribes, we're actually pretty easy to talk to. With just give us a call, and we generally respond, and we try to. And so I think some people are just reluctant. There's like, oh, it's the tribes. I don't know if I should be talking to them or call them up, or how do I do that? It's pretty easy. For our culture, and I was talking to somebody about this just the other day, is that we've been here for thousands of years. We've managed these forests for thousands of years. We have a symbiotic relationship with these forests here, and maintaining them and taking care of them, doing prescribed fire because of all these gifts that the Creator gave us. We need to take care of it. When we haven't been able to have the opportunity to take care of the forest like we used to, and stop doing prescribed fire in the forest and taking care of huckleberry fields and so forth, and as the Smoky Bear came in and said, no, fire is bad, we don't want to do that, that really started the forest starting to get out of balance, and the forest is, in our minds, way out of balance. And so how do we get that back into balance, and how do we work and communicate that to others about how do we take care of the forest from the tribal perspective? And a lot of folks don't know that we've been, there's tribes there. We don't know how long they've been here, but we've been here for thousands of years. And so these forests have been managed that way. And right now we need to get back into something that's more in balance. And so anyway, that's my answer there, but it's just, and also good communications with our neighbors. We have a good neighbor policies. We want to work with all our neighbors, because we're not going anywhere. We're always going to be here forever, and so are our neighbors. So we need to be all working together and going hand in hand and doing good work.
My own professional epiphany was really working in Southern Africa in community-based natural resource management, and seeing sort of how much success, how much impact we could generate when there was trust and responsibility vested in local communities, with technical and financial support from partners, from both public and private sector partners and conservation groups, that sort of created the incentives for stewardship, for sort of thinking 7 generations ahead, thinking about managing the land, not just to generate cash in your pocket or food for your family today, but managing the land in a way that sustains that opportunity generation and generation and generation into the future. And that experience really motivated me to try to bring that vision and values and experience to my work in the United States, and I was very fortunate to find community leaders and partners across Eastern Oregon, and across the state and federal agencies that, were experimenting with this at the same time as I came back from overseas. And I think, the one, we've touched on it a bit, but I think it's important just to say that, my sense is in your other episodes, this has come forth, is that, we're looking at a large, complex landscape and community problem, environmental problem, and it's going to require attention to land use codes and building codes and thinking about defensible space and fire-wise communities. And it's going to require us thinking and working to allow for fire, natural ignitions, and prescribed burning in the backcountry and the wilderness areas, and then working together, really sort of overcoming some of the tensions and barriers that have prevented partnerships to work together in the front country in that working forest area that is not otherwise protected by a wilderness area or other designation, and figuring out how to manage that right through a mixture of tools that include both thinning and prescribed fire, and trying to restore those patterns across the landscape that allow fire to happen safely, as Susan Jane said, that you could sit back and let fire do some of the work. And I think there's a tremendous amount of appetite and opportunity to do that. I mean, we've seen year in and year out that the vast majority of Oregonians embrace that hope and that desire for a win-win types of solutions. And I think the work that community groups across Oregon have done, from Southwest Oregon to the Malheur to ourselves and onto the tribes, have demonstrated that it is possible.
Yeah, I think just picking up on what Nils was saying, in my view, it really does take a community to restore a forest. There's lots of work to be done. There's no shortage of work. And so, I think we're really just limited based on our fear of the unknown and of the fear of failure. But I think, like we were talking before, failure really is doing nothing. We have lots of options for things that we can do on our landscape, both actively and passively, to create to achieve that vision that I talked about earlier, sitting on my porch and with friends and having a beverage and watching, the storm clouds roll in. I think that's achievable. It's achievable, but it's going to take work, and it's going to take working together. And so I'm ready to get after it.
I just want to say, I know all of you, but just how much this has been a really great conversation, and feel like I know all of you better than I did, at the beginning of this. You all are all outstanding stewards, and I think Oregon is really, really fortunate that you call this state home, and you're also innovators and visionaries. And so thank you so much for everything you've done, the Wildfire Council, and thank you for joining us here. This has been a very moving conversation. So thanks. Wow. Very, very impactful conversation. I'm personally just so struck by the common ethos of stewardship with all four of our panelists, and just how deeply grounded they are all in our communities and our ecological health, and really the kind of the unified voice in terms of asking for the support that's needed to manage these landscapes back to resiliency. Kind of the gravity of what's at stake, but also the sense of optimism, and also the sense of real satisfaction of communities coming together and solving problems together, and building upon the success stories that they've had. Kind of curious, Katrina, maybe let's start with you. What's your reaction as you kind of process what we heard today?
Well, the one big takeaway that I'm walking away from with this conversation is that real sincere focus on legacy, and the impact of the decisions that we make today having a either positive or negative effect for 7 generations. That really weighs on my heart and feels like a worthy burden to carry, right? It's something that we think about in my community a lot, sort of like this concept of making sure that our children's children are taken care of, that the next world, or that the world that our children's children experience is better than what we've experienced here in terms of racial justice and opportunities and equal access and all those things. And this really just sort of like broadens the picture of making sure that not only do I want my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren to feel safe living as a Black person in America, but I also want them to feel safe that natural events, people choosing to use the forest doesn't necessarily always result in calamity, but could actually be beneficial and creates a safe environment for them to experience the world as well. That's something that I'm walking away with, a very sense of duty and responsibility.
Yeah, and I think Matt, Katrina, and I are impacted similarly, which probably shouldn't be surprising to anyone. But I will say you cannot help but focus on Bobby's comments. We have been here for thousands of years, speaking of native tribes. We've been here for thousands of years. We will be here. We have a symbiotic relationship with nature because we live off of nature. And a lot of people can enjoy nature, but when your culture has a history of living off of nature and understanding that you have to take care of nature because nature takes care of you, that's a voice that has to be heard. That's a voice that has to be protected and respected.
Centered, really, yeah.
And that's why I'm saying Katrina and I are coming, I think, interpreting and experiencing the conversation today in a very similar fashion. But when you listen to Chris and you listen to Nils and you listen to Susan, everyone is saying the same thing. We have to preserve this asset of nature, and it's not a matter of a zero-sum game. We have to protect it and we have to share it because we all depend on it. It's our watersheds, it's our resource, it's something that we all have to sustain in order to sustain life. And it really is that simple. And that's why I asked Chris that question, who is pushing back to your research and your technology? And he basically said, there aren't many people pushing back, but there's a matter of embracing change. And I was uplifted to hear that because we know we have to do something different. Every panelist we've heard from has touched on the notion that we have a buildup in fuel in our forest that requires us to take action. And Chris Dunn has done the research and he's presented it and it's established. And we have, as you've stated many times, Matt, enough strategy and enough experience in place that we know steps we need to take. And it all comes back to what Bobby Brunoe was saying. You know, my culture has depended on this nature forever, and we will continue to depend on it, and everyone depends on it. So to me, it's an issue that you can't really argue with or refute. It's just a matter of how much you're willing to take the steps to implement strategy and invest the resources required to create the change we need to sustain our forests. And I have to say, it's disheartening and continues to be disheartening when you hear about someone on native land saying we were hit the hardest and we need resources. And we cannot ignore that either. So great panel today. I agree with you and Katrina. I could have listened and could have gone on for another few hours because it was so engaging. Not that all of our other panelists haven't been great, but this really touched close to home because you were getting a perspective from the tribes. And I know Bobby isn't speaking for all tribes, but his story, I think, resonates with others. And I think that was a connection that should carry some weight with everyone when making this decision to invest in our wildfire response and the restoration of our forests.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I really feel like if there's one thing that folks should walk away with, particularly decision makers. It's the fact that they should center that experience when making final decisions, right? Because if you're thinking about it from the perspective of the decisions that I make could result in life or death to someone because they're reliant on food or water or things like that. Not saying that they wouldn't find resilience, which they're one of the most resilient people in the world. So I'm pretty sure they'd be just fine. But, I think centering that experience and that perspective is really important, because what's good for those who are most impacted by something is good, turns out, big surprise, that it's good for everybody. And so I really hope that lawmakers and folks who who have resources that are investing in this, folks who are participating in the conversation, that are engaging in restoration opportunities, that are doing the prescribed burning, that are planning for the future, that are budgeting, really walk away with that front and center in their minds.
Yeah, I think we're all kind of similarly emotional here, kind of listening. And I think I was also very moved by Bobby and his his discussion around symbiosis, and also Bobby, as much as anybody, really calling attention to climate change and the fact that they do have this long-term perspective, and so they can see the changes on the landscape and are concerned about this. And I would say, as you think about that symbiosis, as the globe marches towards a $9 billion person population, by mid-century, and all the climate implications of that, and the impacts on the land, and the greater need that creates for resiliency, it really does speak to the need to operate, and to implement these these recommendations that we've made. We've talked about treating 300,000 acres per year as a goal here for Oregon, which is a significant increase. Perhaps tripling the amount of acres that are currently being treated. And so you think about that symbiosis, as the global population continues to climb, and it really does create this sense of urgency that, status quo just is unfortunately not going to suffice. We have to step up to this challenge. Any final closing thoughts before we wrap up?
I will just say, this is the right kind of drained feeling that we want to have when you have this type of an important conversation. You want to feel the gravity of it. You want to get to the end of that conversation and really know you've touched on some very impactful considerations. And that's what it feels like to me today. And that feels good.
Well, thank you to Katrina Holland and Charles Wilhoite, my co-hosts. Another very important, impactful conversation. Just to reiterate where Charles was leaving off there, that we are dealing with a very significant challenge. That the consequences are very substantial, and particularly pronounced, as we heard today, for our most vulnerable communities. And having said that, we do have the benefit of a lot of lessons learned through tribal traditions, indigenous practices, as well as more recent science. And we've developed a very comprehensive, thought out set of recommendations, strategy here for our state. And what's really needed now is to step up to the magnitude of that challenge and address the challenge at the scale that it demands. And so with that, we are wrapping up this episode 3, which is creating fire resilient landscapes. Next up is episode 4, which is protecting our firefighters, those who put themselves into harm's way to protect other lives, other families, and other resources, and the need in this era of megafire to safely and effectively respond to wildfire. So we look forward to seeing you at that time. And thanks again to my co-hosts.
Thank you. Take care.
Yep. Take care.
That concludes our 3rd episode. Next week, our co-host will talk with experts on how Oregon became a national leader in responding safely and effectively to wildfire, and discuss what challenges and opportunities still remain. If you enjoyed our program today, please invite your friends, family, and colleagues to join us and learn more about wildfires. The future of our forests and our communities depends on it.